e tau mau ki e whiawhini, ko wingoa ko Kalo Afeaki o ko lera mai miha atau hapai, to whaotanga tapu. Ngāti ka ngunu ki te Wairoa, Ailani mo Piritania. Malo au pito to all who have spoken today and for all the whakaaro and amazing things that you've shared. And I just wanted to ask, just to check if actually people are there, can we all come off mute and repeat after me? I'll just wait for you guys to come off mute. If you could all come off mute and repeat after me, Maloe Lele. Malo Pito, you have now spoken in the words of my beautiful home island of Tonga, where I was raised. I am the proud daughter of a farming family, so a family that has nurtured and shaped the land that I grew up on, land that is now being destroyed by the impacts of climate change. So I'm here today speaking on behalf of the Pacific Climate Warriors, the Whanganui-a-Tara team. And yeah, next slide, please. So before I launch into my talanoa for today, I just wanted to provide a brief overview of what I'll be covering. I will share about the whakapapa of the Pacific Climate Warriors. I will share about the mission, or our kaupapa. I'll also share about how we use our Indigenous knowledge and global networks to formulate actions that combat climate change. Next slide, please. So I think, it's important to highlight the issue, even if you do know. But it's my time, so you'll have to listen anyway. But climate change is happening and its impacts are being felt by Pacific nations that are on the front line. The injustice of it all is that the Pacific emits the least amount of carbon, and yet islands like Tuvalu, Kiribati, and my home of Tonga are feeling the impacts of climate change, from sea level rise to extreme cyclones. We are on the front lines of the climate crisis. And right now, our beautiful Pacific region prepares for cyclone season. At least 2 tropical cyclones are predicted to cross Tonga's waters specifically during the cyclone season, with a high chance that one will be severe. We deal with climate change whilst also dealing with a COVID crisis. So again, speaking to the injustice of this issue. Next slide, please. Climate change is happening, and it's easy to perceive the Pacific as a region just waiting for the impacts to destroy us. These images usually take up the media slots: cyclones devastating homes, sea levels rising and flooding whole towns. I'm sure that there will be more now that we are entering cyclone season. And a lot of times the perception of the Pacific is that we are victims of climate change, that we are helpless and waiting for the impacts to devastate us. Next slide, please. The reality, though, is far from that. Langi shared about how Samoan communities rallied together after Cyclone Evan. They did not wait around for outside help. And our people in the Pacific are resilient. We are not victims. We are not waiting around for developed nations to change. We are making them change. Our warriors continue to hold our world leaders to account. Pictured on the slide is one of our warriors, Brianna Fruin. She's been fighting against climate change since she was 11 years old. She is now 23. She spoke at COP26 around the power of words. And the word I wanted to share with you today is warrior, which in many Pacific cultures is someone who is a guardian, a steward, a protector, someone who protects our lands, our oceans, our customs, and our families. And so the Pacific Climate Warriors work tirelessly to protect our islands and oceans because it's our whatongia, it's our duty to do that. I guess sort of on that note, I also wanted to provide a little bit of history around the formation of PCW. So in 2013, our network of young Pacific Islanders began to form under the name of 350 Pacific to join with the global climate change movement, 350.org. We are a global network of volunteers. So we do this on top of our paid work, which pays for my food and rent. And we are active in 15 of our Pacific Island nations with 8 teams in the diaspora, which is Aotearoa, Australia, and the United States. We have a unique approach of empowering our young people to understand the issue of climate change and to take action to protect and enrich our islands and culture. So the formation also of the warriors was not just to combat climate change, but to also challenge the framing of Pacific peoples as victims of climate change. So for too long, the Pacific was being talked about without its voice being valued or amplified. Global conferences like COP would speak about the Pacific, framing it as a region incapable of fighting climate change, a region just waiting for developed countries to come save it. The warriors mantra pictured on the screen, we are not drowning, we are fighting, challenges this notion and really aims to signify that we are a people that are fighting for the future of our islands. We are not victims who are waiting for handouts, we are warriors. You know, our work is diverse because the cultures and needs of the Pacific is diverse, from storytelling to policy infiltration, to changing agricultural systems, to changing how we define activism. Our work has many layers and some examples follow. Next slide, please. Our work values not just the science of climate change, but also the importance of Indigenous knowledge systems within our actions to fight climate change. In 2014, our warriors were involved in the Newcastle blockade, where alongside other groups, they blockaded one of the biggest coal ports in the world based in Australia. And they used canoes built and brought over from Vanuatu. A beautiful story that was shared around the lead up to this action was that when the warriors in Vanuatu were looking at building the canoes, they, like all of us, reached out to their kaumatua or elders for guidance. Unfortunately, though, a lot of the knowledge around canoe building or carving had not been passed down. And so a lot of the kaumatua didn't actually know the traditional way of building canoes. This, however, presented an opportunity for both rangatahi and kaumatua to work at piecing together the knowledge of traditional canoe building. The canoes were built and transported to Australia, which created a powerful image you can see on the slide of our beautiful Vanuatu canoes going up against massive metal coal ships. They did break, but they were fixed with some duct tape. And our warriors continued to block the coal port all day, costing the company millions. Indigenous knowledge tends to be undervalued by Western and Eurocentric systems, even to this day, where you have Palangi men in Auckland who like to claim that Indigenous science is not real science. Fortunately for us, we pay no attention to these backdated comments and continue to fight for our cultures and islands. Next slide, please. We are also a global network, which supports the sharing of knowledge throughout our actions and work. An example of this is the work being carried out by one of our warriors, Mikaele Mayava. So Mika is pictured there. And he is of Tokelauan descent. So Tokelau, as many of us would know, is extremely vulnerable to climate change, with sea level rise threatening its survival. And yet they are fighting and are resilient. They are, after all, the first 100% solar powered country, which is honestly an amazing feat. Not only this, but they continue to explore creative ways to combat the impacts of climate change. For example, Mika has been leading an initiative around keyhole gardens, so you can see those pictured on the slide. Just some context. So the soil in Tokelau has become so salinized by rising sea levels that they now have to elevate their gardens and crops to ensure that salt water doesn't infiltrate the soil. Mika was able to develop this initiative after taking learnings from Africa, specifically Zimbabwe, who created this technique to grow crops in desert areas. A beauty of the keyhole gardens is that they are accessible to all. So Tokelau has a unique food sharing system called Inati, which means that the community will also benefit from the work Mika is carrying out. So yes, there's a benefit to being a global network because we are able to then tap into global initiatives and then develop them to fit our Pacific context. Next slide, please. Climate change, again, is happening in the Pacific, and yet we continue to rise up and fight for our islands. At the start of 2019, my co-coordinator, Mary Moyonokorio, and I established the Te Whanganui-a-Tara branch of the Warriors. We have made waves when it comes to fighting climate change, if I say so myself. From our first public action, which was at Tokelau Hatele on the steps of Parliament, to our RISE event at Victoria University of Wellington. We have hosted and run countless panels and workshops like this. We've infiltrated policy spaces. I say infiltrate and I mean it. And we've carried out an oral and written submission for the Zero Carbon Bill. We released our 350 Pacific climate priorities, calling out the New Zealand government's climate change response. We mobilized the Pacific community to lead 40,000 people during the September strike, which we co-hosted with School Strike for Climate. Not a lot of people remember that, but it's okay, I'll remind you. And a story I would really like to share about celebrating Indigenous knowledge was in the lead up to the 2019 September climate strike. Mary and I had discussions around what we would do during the strike and also what we would wear. We were worried that if we were to dress in our traditional clothing, that this may come across as performative. These were conversations we had up until the night before, and yet on the morning of the strike, we knew that our culture and traditions were not performative, as many Palangi ideologies had made us think, but that we were honoring our ancestors and our histories. We danced, well, I didn't, I tried to just keep walking, but we danced, we sang, and we held true to our cultures and languages because they are of value in this fight against climate change. Final slide, please. To close, I would like to emphasize again that climate change can be a daunting and overwhelming issue. A lot of our youth don't know how they fit, or don't know how they can get involved, or also don't believe that they have anything of value to contribute. The Pacific, however, does not have the luxury to sit back and wait. The need to fight is urgent. And so I hope that you find how you fit within climate spaces and take the actions that are meaningful to you. Leve levai malanga tu alfa tu. Malo pito.